In the eyes of investors, there is very little slowing down Netflix these days. The company's stock has been red hot, up 90% this year, pushing its market valuation above that of Disney. It's a long way from the early days of Netflix and its DVD by mail business, but even then Netflix was disrupting traditional movie rental players like Blockbuster. Co-founder Marc Randolph was along for that ride, serving as the first CEO before leaving the company after its IPO in 2002. I spoke to him last night and started our conversation by asking when he first knew that Netflix was onto something big.
Well, there's a whole bunch of little moments where it almost became a reality and didn't. So you've got to pick the right one. But there really was a moment because we spent probably 2+ years trying to come up with something that would allow us to actually make money on a business. And we tried hundreds and hundreds of things. And so it was probably a moment when we finally came up with our subscription by mail service that marked the point where we kind of said, wow, this actually might work.
So you guys were excited about it, but what was the feedback that you got from others? Because we always talk about those early moments in the evolution of a new business and all the naysayers that are out there.
Well, certainly most people are telling you that'll never work because that's the nature of new ideas. Everyone has some reason why it's a stupid idea. So you're constantly hearing that. But we had tried so many things that we knew what we were looking for. We were looking for that glimmer of customers saying, wow, we like this, we'll tell our friends about it, we'll keep doing it month after month. And when that happens, you can tell. Just, you know it.
And it feels like with a business like Netflix, there has always been a quiet confidence, but always a high level of skepticism. And yet, here we sit today, we're talking about a company that went public with a big valuation, $300 million, and today is valued at $160 billion. I mean, what's the first thing that comes into mind when you think about that?
Well, it's astounding to me. I mean, at every stage, I never could have imagined the success Netflix has seen. I mean, even on day one, when I thought we'd have maybe 5 or 6 orders and we had 100, that was astounding. When we got to finally broke the code and figured out how to make this work, and then we ended up with 250,000 subscribers, and then 1 million, of course now in the hundreds. But every stage, I just can't imagine we had gotten to the point we've gotten to.
What are some of the early lessons you learned in building the business that maybe are fundamental to any startup, getting through that ugly period that allows you at least to have a fighting chance and for us to now be talking about the success that Netflix has had around the world?
Well, I think the most important thing we learned was not to fall in love with our ideas, because usually most of the ideas were bad ones. It was building this system and this culture that allowed us to try hundreds of bad ideas that eventually enabled us to stumble on something that actually worked. Because each time you test something that doesn't work, you learn a bit more about it. And it takes you closer and closer and closer as you eventually hone in on something which customers actually want.
You use that word culture, and a lot of people have looked at Netflix not just because it thought about new ways of doing business, but it felt it did a lot to rethink what it is to be an organization, probably based on your experiences and the experiences of Reed Hastings on, do you need to have vacation days? All those things that on the HR side, a lot of companies just plow ahead with. But what was the thinking there?
Well, the thinking is basically that you realize that people want to do good work. And when you look at all the systems that companies put in place, you begin to say, are these things helping people do good work? Are they trying to control what they do? Are they hindering their efforts? So building that type of culture is a method is basically just stripping away all those little impediments, all those approvals, all those requirements that just slow you down. And Netflix has been phenomenal at streamlining, fundamentally letting people be empowered to make decisions, which allows them to move quickly and creatively and disruptively.
It allows them to be more innovative.
Absolutely right. Yeah. Because when something comes, when conditions change, you don't need to tell my director, then he tells his director, then he runs it up, then there's a big meeting, and then there's a study, and then 6 months later you move 2 degrees to the right. If you've empowered people truly, where they don't need to be asking permission all the time, they don't need to be running things up and down the flagpole, when something happens, they can adapt to change for it right away. And not only does it make the company more effective, it makes people really enjoy working there, which allows you to attract and retain a much better quality of person.
We have obviously seen around the world this excitement with startup culture, probably because of the success of companies like Netflix or Facebook. You can pick any handful that everyone aspires to be that next big hit. But here in Canada, there is that challenge of taking a small business and growing it into a large business. A lot of times we hear it's not the product or the idea, but it's building the sales team. I mean, for those who are wondering how you go from being an idea to being a legitimate business that allows you to disrupt or innovate, what would you say to that?
Well, I see you've got to take everything one step at a time. I mean, no big company started off saying, we're going to be a huge company. They just said we're going to be a bit bigger than we are now. And they take that first step, then that next step. And so certainly being a business in Canada will have its unique challenges, but fundamentally, no different than any place in the world where you're trying to compete, trying to do things differently, trying to perhaps disrupt someone or prevent yourself from being disrupted. It all comes down to empowering people, letting them make decisions, giving them the tools they need, and then staying out of the way.
Is that true for a startup and for an established business? Because given the rise of Netflix, people say, wow, look at Netflix has a bigger market valuation than Disney, and Disney's trying to now do battle with Netflix. Or whether it's retail or banking, any industry right now, there are these traditional companies that are feeling like they've got to do something, and yet they have rich cultures. They have a lot of existing infrastructure. So how do you get into that mindset that a startup might have when you're a large organization?
Well, the first thing I will say is yes, it is considerably harder to be responsive, disruptive, innovative when you're a much larger company with tens of thousands of employees than it is when you have 10 people. But it's not impossible. And you may not be able to do it in every single department, but some departments, product, marketing, sales, they can be disruptive, they can be nimble. It fundamentally comes down to culture. And if you've spent years and years perfecting a method and a process where you always take A and put it in box B, and then take box B and put it on shelf C, you're going to have a very hard time when all of a sudden there's no boxes involved anymore. The people you've chosen are all about reducing costs and being efficient. Those are different people than the ones you want to respond to a whole new way of doing things. So it is hard, but it's required. If you're doing the same processes over and over and over again, if you're not being creative and innovative, I think you're doomed.
So do you keep any Netflix early days memorabilia, anything to remind you of how far the company's come? Any little anecdotes on that front?
I certainly do. I have a little memorabilia fold. I call them the archives. And it's some interesting things. I mean, for example, of course, we started our business not streaming, but shipping DVDs. Right. I have one of the original envelopes. I have one of the first packing slips for order number 1. I actually have the bank deposit slip from the very, very first money we took and started the company with. And that I actually have framed on my desk as a way of kind of saying, you know, every company, even huge ones, all start out the same way with nothing.
It's a great story. Interesting conversation there with Marc Randolph, the Netflix co-founder, joining us.